so now you see, I mean, you see really incredibly stupid behavior about COVID. It's like climbing in fast forward. It's just mind-bogglingly stupid to say, okay, I'm going to tie the hands of the individual cities and schools to implement their own measures. It's just like anti-COVID measures are intrinsically bad. Well, that's just crazy.
This time, climate scientist Michael Tobis returns to the Plutopia podcast. Michael and John discuss the conflict of fascism versus internationalism, the right-wing co-opting of the anti-vax movement, conservative resistance to climate science, and virtue signaling on social media. They also wonder if democracy can survive the right's fascination with fascism.
Hey everybody, we're here for another episode of the Plutopia podcast, and our guest today is Michael Tobis, who has been a guest here before, and he's been very interested in science and public policy and how they interface for many years. He's got a doctorate from the University of Wisconsin in Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences, and he developed a 3D model on a custom computing platform there. He's actually a bit of a computer whiz as well, and has done some software development. And he's been writing about sustainability for years and knows a lot about climate change. So that's what we often talk about when we get together. So hello, Michael.
How do you do?
How is everything going where you are? You're in Canada.
That's correct. I'm in Ottawa, Canada, and we're having a lovely summer, and things are pretty much okay. My wife and I have a little art gallery that keeps us busy, and other than that, I sit around and worry about the future of the planet sometimes still. So
and why not?
And why not? And why not? Yeah. So I just happened across an article I wrote in 2010 predicting what the world would be like in 2030. And I wasn't too far off the mark. And it seemed like at the time I was planning to do this every decade, do a 20-year prediction. And I guess I'd forgotten, so I'm a year late now. But I started thinking about what I thought about 2040. And while everybody's finally tuning in to how serious climate change is, I looked at what I predicted, and it was all about climate change, and it didn't really talk about some other scary things that I see coming down the pike. And it was kind of brutal for me to start thinking about 2040, because while I'm not super optimistic we'll get climate change under control, I see other things happening that might take us off the rails sooner than that.
Like, for instance?
Well, I don't think we're really moving towards the sort of spirit of Enlightenment democracy that I don't know, you and I probably expected when we were kids. We were, the arc of history bending toward justice and all that. It just doesn't seem to be going that way.
Well, I had an undergraduate government professor, a guy named Rod Bell, who I'm still in touch with. And in his class, this would have been 1969, he talked quite a bit about how there were strains of proto-fascism within the U.S., and that a move to fascism was, if not an inevitability, a likely thing. And it's taken a while, but it does appear that he may have been onto something, because we certainly see fascist tendencies in some of the political figures that are in power right now.
Right, and it's not just the United States. I mean, there a lot of countries are seeing these things happening. And I think there are organized international forces that are pulling in that direction.
Yeah.
Why they are doing that isn't clear. It seems like a fascist power is sort of more constrained by a competing fascist power than by a democratic power. So I don't know why they want that world. Putin apparently has written quite explicitly that he thinks, ethnicities and states should be the same. So there should be a Russian state, and everyone who's not Russian in Russia, they can just, take their lumps. And so they're basically, there's this push towards a dominant ethnicity, and I think that's very much in the history of fascism. It's us against them, and
the white guys against everybody else. Is that it?
Scapegoating the minorities, and so what goes up against that is a sort of internationalism, which is sort of, yes, everybody's equal, and we should be equal under the law, and we should have the same laws for everybody. And if we protect any particular culture with specific things, it should not be the majority. So I think that leaves people in an awkward position.
Is there?
I don't think you give a sort of a way to be who you are in this world where the left is internationalist and the right is fascist, and there isn't really a way for the main culture to express itself without being in opposition to the other cultures in a country.
Well, if I was a proponent of fascism, what I would argue is that the world has a better chance of surviving if we have an authoritarian government that basically, an authoritarian government that actually believes in climate change and that believes that COVID is a thing and believes in vaccinations and so forth would just make everybody do that stuff, right? But that's not what we're seeing right now. The weird thing to me about it is that I can definitely see an authoritarian strain within explicitly the GOP now, but at the same time, there's that strong libertarian element there who thinks that they're speaking up for individual freedom. And those things it seems like to me like they would be in tension, but somehow they don't seem to be within the GOP.
Boy, that there is a whole bunch of stuff there. Libertarian fascism doesn't actually make sense, right?
Yeah, exactly.
But the way I see this operating is it's a if I look at the sinister side of it, if I look at who's going to come after Trump and his ilk, the Brazilian guy, I can never remember how to pronounce his name.
Bolsonaro.
Who's going to come after these buffoons? Who's going to be actually a competent, vicious leader? And I don't know if that happens, but if there's something like that going on, then what I see these people doing is sort of hoovering up all the crackpots, right?
Yeah.
So vaccine phobia was kind of a lefty thing. But it's adopted by the right because, hey, here's all these paranoids we can add to our stable of paranoids. So, so there's all these people we can get to support us. All we have to do is say they're one crackpot thing. So the right has won over a lot of vaccine paranoids by doing this, who tended to cluster on the left before, I think. There was a sort of environmental purity, keep your stuff out of my water, keep your stuff out of my blood concept. And so if the right sees a bunch of people who believe something really strange and a responsible leader won't have anything to do with them, they'll just suck them up. So that means every crazy idea gets in there. It doesn't mean they're going to act on it when they have power, right? On the other hand,
they'll just speak to it to get power.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's assuming that they're really smart, which isn't obvious. It's not clear that they're behaving the way they are because they really have a plan to achieve power, or they're behaving the way they are because it's almost algorithmic. It's almost like this behavior seems to reward my quest for power, so I will do it. And it's not clear that they have a plan of what they're going to do. They're just going to ride their resentment into the sunset. I don't know.
I've been sort of wondering about that. Is it just sort of like literally blind power? They're blind to any particular intention, but they know that they want power.
Right. And so now you see really incredibly stupid behavior about COVID. It's like climate and fast forward. It's just mind-bogglingly stupid to say, okay, I'm going to tie the hands of the individual cities and schools to implement their own measures. It's just like anti-COVID measures are intrinsically bad. Well, that's just crazy.
Well, and it's kind of weird that they're sort of speaking out against vaccinations and definitely speaking out against masks. And, there's many things that we're compelled to do for various reasons. Seatbelts is a good example. I used to hate wearing a seatbelt. I'm used to it now, but I know a lot of people didn't want to wear seatbelts, but they eventually got to it, and it was a safety measure. The idea that people are so violently opposed to a logical public health measure is strange to me. And it really seems to be driven by a kind of, it has cultural drivers. It's not something that they've worked out with their intelligence. It's not something that it's just an emotional thing. And the idea is, you're trying to force me to put this thing on my face, and you can't do that because I have freedom. But there's a lot of ways that our freedoms are constrained. The seatbelts were an example, but we can think of a lot of other ones.
Right. You need a passport to drive your car, right?
You need to have a license. And what happens when people start saying, well, it's wrong for you to require me to have a driver's license or to prove that I know how to drive in order to be able to just drive a car. I should just be able to drive the car.
Right. So, yeah, it's incoherent. So here in
Why
Canada,
do I have to buy a ticket to get on your airplane? That doesn't make sense. I should just be able to get on your airplane.
Okay, well, but then they can go into private. but yeah. So Alberta is trying to criminalize criticizing the oil industry at this point.
Criticizing who?
The oil industry.
Oh, really?
Yeah. They're setting up all sorts of initiatives to make it impossible to criticize the oil industry. So yeah, it's incoherent. It's just, I don't like you, so I'm going to make your life unpleasant, sort of thing.
Well, so getting back to the climate change, we saw this early on. In the whole climate conversation is kind of where you could first see the rumblings of this kind of pushback against science and against
pioneers.
reason.
We're pioneers, and since all along, yeah. The stolen email thing, that was us. We started that. Yeah, us. So many people might not remember this, but a bunch of climate scientist emails were stolen, and a great fake ruckus was made up about it.
Yeah.
There was really nothing there, but a lot of people are to this day convinced that there was some sort of scandal without being able to actually say what it was. So that's been repeated a bunch of times.
That's an interesting point there, that thing about not being able to say exactly what it was. I realized that one of Trump's strategies that the GOP has kind of adopted too is that if you just call for an investigation of something, The investigation doesn't have to show anything. In fact, what you want is to have the investigation run for as long as you can get it to run, because it creates fear, uncertainty, and doubt in the minds of people, even if you know that it's not going to pick up anything. And that's what we see now with voting, all these investigations of voting. And even if the people who are claiming that Trump actually won are idiots, or people like Mike Lindell or those attorneys that he had, Giuliani, even if they're like not making any sense, they're creating noise. It's like what Steve Bannon said was flood the system with shit. And that's basically kind of what they've been very successful in doing.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And there is a lot of FUD about the election.
Yeah. One thing that scares me is that they're actually doing the stuff that they're accusing the other side of doing. So if everybody says, no, elections are free and fair and perfect, and then they go around and steal the next one, I mean, why aren't they investigating close elections that went the other way? It would be a lot more interesting if that was on the table. But yeah, it could be a bit of a trap, right? But yeah, noise. So there's this sense that climate science is some sort of illegitimate pursuit, which is ridiculous because it doesn't pay that well, and nobody's really. I mean, it's not like we were getting huge subsidies from wind turbine people in the 90s. The wind turbine people didn't exist in the 90s. There was nobody to shovel money at us for like 20 years. Now you could say there's an industry that might be motivated to overstate the case, but there certainly wasn't for a long period of time. And there was no such motive but people think there was, right? People say, well, climate scientists, they're motivated to cause alarm. And yeah, that odor of oh yeah, well, they say that, but they're not serious. They're just feathering their own nest is there, and people suspect that at all times. And that was a clever move on their part. Like I said, we're pioneers. We were the target pretty early on for a lot of these tricks. So it was almost like we were their beta site, and they could try out all these tricks.
I'm not sure what they expected. I mean, climate change as a real thing is going to affect them too. They're gonna be affected by global disasters just like everybody else.
Okay, sure, but let me play devil's advocate on that one, because when I lived down there in Texas, I was working at the geophysics department, which was an odd place for someone like me to work, because basically half of that department was directly in the interests of the oil industry, and the entire culture was not climate culture. It was an oil culture. And so I got to know these people, and from where they're sitting, they're the good guys. They say, well, we've been providing the energy for the world, and people should thank us. People shouldn't blame us for this. And so they're not inclined to believe any of this themselves, right? There's a sort of a prior belief that you're doing a good thing. And if somebody like me comes along and says, well, maybe it's not as good as it used to be, and it's going to start getting really to be a bad thing, and they're the ones who are motivated to they're the ones who have their careers on the line. There's always going to be a climate. There might not always be an oil industry. So I think there's a lot of sincere doubt that they started with. I think at this point it's kind of crazy. I mean, the hottest temperature on Earth was recorded this year at Death Valley. The hottest temperature in Canada, almost 130 degrees. The hottest temperature in Europe was just recorded this week. I mean, this is crazy stuff. And how people can just sort of shrug and say, well, you might have said this was going to happen and it might be happening, but that's a coincidence. I mean, how they wrap their heads around that, I don't know.
You know, in 2000, I was writing an article that appeared in Whole Earth magazine in 2001 under the name Being Green in 2001. But it was really about climate change.
Mm-hmm.
And I was living in Boulder at the time, so I talked to Jim White, who is a professor at the University of Colorado. You know, he was involved in geological sciences and in climate studies, among other things. And he told me, he said, well, you know, kind of the problem that scientists have is that we work with hypotheses. So we're sort of loath to say something is definitely happening or going to happen. We just express a hypothesis, you know, and we understand that there's a chance that it won't happen always, or that it won't happen exactly the way we think it'll happen. We just put a model out there or a hypothesis or whatever. So, you know, kind of falling short of making an absolute prediction. No prediction is really absolute. And he said that because of that, scientists had been reluctant to come right out and say, we are absolutely going to be screwed by climate change, by this global warming problem that we have. They would be a little bit hesitant, you know, and it's like people on the right who are climate deniers will say this as, well, science is never settled, you know, it's not settled. And they didn't want to say that it was settled. And that was one of the reasons that they weren't getting the point across. And of course, eventually they started writing letters and scientists would sign them and they'd say, we're, you know, 99.9% sure that we're screwed, basically, if we don't do something.
Right.
But it didn't work because there was already this feeling that, well, scientists don't really know that for sure. You know, well, you know, and now we have a 4,000-page report from the IPCC that says, yes, we know this for sure.
Yeah, actually, there is language in there that says, like, you know, at this point, I think the word unequivocal was used.
Yeah.
It's like they had the spectrum for, you know, likely, very likely, extremely likely. They hadn't used the word unequivocal before.
It seems like.
But yeah, it's there's something to be said for that. When I was in the thick of the field and we'd get together over beers and talk, there wasn't a lot of uncertainty. Basically, the words "we're fucked" would come up quite a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is
I'm trying to find the wording here. I found a fairly long summary of the report, and somewhere in there they say, what is it? It is this is where unequivocal is used. The actual sentence is, it is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the global climate system since pre-industrial times. And then they present, apparently at length in the report, they present the evidence for that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's something
there's no beating around the bush anymore. And then
Yeah.
I think the next sentence says it's going to keep going for a while, and the effects are going to get more severe. And these are facts, you know, they're not debating points anymore. but people will still debate them. I mean, they're going to debate face masks. They're going to debate that.
Well, the point of this sixth assessment report by the IPCC, as I understand it, was to actually make that case. That
well,
yes,
there is no point to the IPCC. I shouldn't admit this, but in a sense, it's got institutional momentum. It's going to keep producing these reports. People think it's a well-funded institution. It's really not. It's almost entirely a volunteer effort. But it has been an organizing principle for a big chunk of science, and they're not going to change. They're going to keep producing these every few years.
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking about the fact that the actual title of the report is "The Physical Science Basis of Climate Change."
That's working group one's remit. So there's three working groups. There's the physical science, there's the impacts, and there's the mitigation adaptation group. And I think those are in decreasing order of how much attention you should pay to them. The third group being mostly economists, and I don't take what they do very seriously. And with the impacts group, it's not very well organized. I mean, basically everybody comes in and has their impact, and they want to make sure it gets in the report. And there are a lot of them, and there's not really a cohesive community. The physical science community is a very tight and very impressive community. And in spite of what everyone on the outside seems to think, they're real scientists and are very good at questioning their own beliefs. They're not dogmatic. They don't have an axe to grind. It's just reality that is telling the story. And I think most of the field would have preferred if reality hadn't told that story.
Yeah. I mean, it's a good point. That it used to be that you were talking about predictions, but now you just point out the window and say, look, it's happening.
Yeah, there's that too, right? But yeah, I mean, you point to the hospital wards and say, yeah, look, it's happening. And somehow people have a way of looking the other way. And that's really what has changed in the last 10 years. And I think that's my point, is when I start thinking about the future, I see that the internet that we had so much confidence in has backfired on us terribly. And rather than being a mechanism for us to think and reason together and come to consensus, it's become a mechanism for kicking off emotions and supercharging the mechanisms of fascism.
Well, to be fair, it works both ways. I mean, it does both of those things. You can still do meaningful collaboration with the internet, but we're being drowned out by the high volume of the voices of the crazies.
Well, and this is what I mean by fascism being algorithmic. So shortly before I left Texas, there was an exhibit at the Bullock History Museum on propaganda. I don't know if you caught that. It was really very interesting for me. And I should point out here that my parents lived through the Holocaust. They were refugees when they came over to this side of the ocean. And many of my closest relatives died in basically Nazi, I don't like to use the word Holocaust, it's kind of trite, atrocities, basically massive atrocities. So this is personal for me. When you talk about the Nazis and you look at this exhibit, really explained the propaganda side. That was the name of the exhibit, was propaganda. And it really explained how that operated, how it came to be that the Nazis created this enemy out of this subpopulation that had always been there, and was at that point being rapidly integrated. into the general society and made enemies out of them. And one of the things was systematic spreading of rumors. So they would assign people to go to the bars and the beer halls and the churches and say bad things about the Jews. And they also had all these quite modern, and I if it wasn't actually trying to kill me personally, I would say graphically brilliant posters and icons, and the whole design stuff was just a breakthrough in advertising. I mean, nobody had ever seen such good advertising before. The swastika is really, if you like forget what a swastika means, it's really a great logo. So they had marketing skills, and they also had absolutely conscienceless ability to concoct and distribute lies in sort of whispers. And what Facebook has done for us is monetize that and weaponize it. I mean, basically, if Goebbels had his hands on Facebook, he would have been very happy. So when it was sort of at that point that I was starting to see through some of my less educated friends on Facebook, I was starting to see really dubious beliefs pop up.
Yeah.
And there was this one, I think the moment that I really had a sinking feeling about it was this one post from, it looked like a Bernie post. I mean, it was pro-Bernie post. But the stuff it was saying about Hillary, I recognized the writing style, right? I recognized that it was coming from the same shop as was writing about climate change. And it was like a leftist thing. But it was full of, I could just tell that it was lies from the way it was written. And it's not, they don't exactly lie. They give you a bunch of facts that aren't actually connected and let you connect the dots. But they only give you one way to connect the dots, and they don't actually connect that way. So it seemed to me like there was an organized manipulation of people to make them angry at each other.
Right.
Almost as if the people doing this didn't care if the left wins or the right wins. They mostly cared that society was divided into groups that hated.
Creating chaos. And that was my assumption too, all along, was that they weren't really trying to. And I had a pretty strong assumption that Putin and his people were involved in this, which
That's
really
my
seems
sense
to
of
be
it
the
too.
case, and that Putin, had figured out a way to bring America down, and that was what it was really about, and that there were Americans who were on board with the idea of bringing America down for whatever reasons. One of them being Trump. Well, Trump really, I don't know if he was smart enough to even realize what he was doing. He seems to have cognitive issues, but he did make sort of like the ideal operative for them to have in the White House.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I also thought it was Putin, but I think it's got a life of its own now.
Well, it does, and it kind of served his purposes, but that was kind of where I was saying there were people in America who also had an interest in bringing America down or making America into something different. Not that they necessarily had, I mean, you get a bunch of people together and they may all assume that they're thinking the same thing, even when they're not, and that's actually,
I hear you.
That's one of the things I learned in that class, where he was talking about how America could become fascist. And one of the things that he talked about was like the social construction of reality, and how people do make assumptions about what they're all thinking, and it allows them to sort of integrate with each other, even though they may not be thinking the same thing. They think they're thinking the same
I
thing.
think there's the same thing, and they have symbols and
Branding.
branding. What's the word they use? I forget now. I'm close to this. This is a common word on the internet. Basically, you act a certain way to identify with your group. It'll come to me anyway. As you get old, it gets harder and harder to explain things to people, because if you lose the word, you go blah.
Yeah,
but,
exactly.
Yeah, that thing. Signaling, virtue signaling.
Virtue signaling. Yeah.
That's what I'm fishing around for. Yeah. So they're signaling that they're part of a tribe without necessarily having a really well thought out belief structure. It's just no matter what you believe, it's not as bad as what they believe. And so that's how it gets all crazier and crazier. And like I said, I think I agree with you. I had the sense that Putin was behind it. He certainly was trained in the methods of the Nazis. He's got his KGB background. He knows how to do these things. And I think the Russians are the experts at this. So I definitely think he started it. But I think if he went away, it wouldn't stop. At this point, he's got the ball rolling. And the other thing, it's not just America. There are various reasons that Canada isn't as far along on this cascade of doom, but it's here, it's happening. We're glad that we left. We're glad that we missed the Trump years, but it's scary here too, and scary in a lot of other countries.
Well, it's the world. It's not just
the
US, but the US has been a world leader.
Yes.
And that didn't go away when Trump stepped into the office, and he had an undeniable influence globally too.
Yeah,
especially with people who were his kind of people.
Yeah, and actually, bringing it back to climate, the day after the election, my first thought was the chances for a soft landing on climate just went to zero. It was a long shot before that, but I don't think we're getting a soft landing, and I didn't think when he got in, I basically said to myself, I'm not really sure what I'm fighting for, because we're in for 20 years of things getting worse. Because you can't, if you don't have a way to talk to the general public, if you can't connect real expertise with democracy, you're going to drive the whole thing over a cliff, and sooner or later. And this COVID thing seems like it's sooner. I mean, who saw all this stuff coming?
Well, however, on the other hand, the people who are not taking COVID seriously and who are in danger of being most affected by it are the people on the right. And
yeah, but it's not like, I mean, it's not like it's 100% fatal. And what you're going to have is they'll take even more damage than they've already taken, and they'll be even angrier than they are. So I don't know that that's. Yeah, you could argue that these things are hurting their own people more than they're hurting anybody else, but that doesn't change the power dynamic very much. You've still got all these people, and they'll be madder than ever. How they convince themselves that it's not their own damn fault, they'll have help. Fox will tell them how to do that. And the weird thing is, in terms of making a prediction, is that George Orwell predicted a lot of this stuff in the 40s, right?
Yeah.
1984 almost reads like it's now. The way that the party tells you what to believe, and you just turn around and believe it, and you change your beliefs on a dime because you've been told to do that.
Yeah, I was saying that just the other day that we really need to get the message across that 1984 was a work of fiction and not a manual.
Right. It's the damnedest thing. And and there's Big Brother. We certainly have Big Brother going on. We certainly have the corruption of language, so that it means the opposite of what it ought to mean. I mean, freedom is slavery, all that stuff. What does freedom mean anymore?
What did it ever mean? I mean,
I don't know.
freedom is never absolute, right? And that's one thing that it's a point that we keep making. Freedom is actually shared freedom. And when you're sharing freedom, that means your freedom is constrained by the freedom of others.
But it's interesting because one of our artists in our gallery is basically, she takes photographs of wild horses. She goes to all these crazy places and visits with the wild horses, and she actually has some skill in getting to know these horses, and she does portraits of them. And she talks about freedom, and Irene said, well, I'm an American, and freedom is now a loaded word for me. And the photographer was very taken aback, because freedom is what her work's about. It's about wild horses. What could be more free than that? And Irene said, freedom makes me think of somebody carrying a Confederate flag, and which is the opposite of freedom, right? It's freedom is slavery.
Yeah.
So these words get corrupted. So it wasn't the concept I was bringing up, it was the word I was bringing up, as the connotations of the word get eaten up. And liberalism used to mean open to all sides of the argument. Didn't mean
communist,
Soviet communism.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and it's funny, you hear some of these fascists calling people fascists because they know that fascism is not a good thing, and they understand that they're fascists. But if they say the guy over there is a fascist, then that's a pretty good deflection, right?
Right. There's the deflection thing.
So now the liberals become fascists.
So and this was one of Orwell's main points, was you want to protect the language, you want to protect the meaning of words. And I've kind of been doing this in the climate world a lot, is trying to defend meanings, and it's under constant attack. So the journalists have decided that climate change and global warming mean the same thing. And it's in the style book. You can use either one. And I'm going, no, these are two separate concepts. Global warming is a type of climate change. It's not. Climate change is a larger concept, and global warming is a smaller concept, and they both have meanings. And we're in a context where we need to know what they both mean. And they just go and garble it. And now everybody thinks that it's the people who want it to be less of a problem call it climate change, and the people who want it to be more of a problem call it global warming. No, they're two different concepts.
I never was comfortable with global warming because it's too easy to point your finger at like something like Austin in February when it's colder than usual and say, well, where's your where's your global warming?
Where's your global warming? Now,
I always favored calling it climate instability.
Well, okay, so now that is something that we should talk about if we want to talk about climate, and a lot of your audience is in Texas. Was that a climate change event or wasn't it? I mean, it was definitely a weird event.
Well, it was
lot of,
a shifting of the polar vortex farther
yeah,
south than it would normally shift, right?
right,
So could that have been driven by climate change? It
right,
certainly
right.
was a sign of instability, I would think.
Yeah. Um,
You know better than I do because you are the climate scientist.
I would say it's at best inconclusive. I think if you would ask people, if you'd ask climate scientists in January if they thought such a thing was more likely, most of them would have said no. So, and then it goes and happens. So you know that it's actually possible now. Is it more possible now than it was before?
Well, I don't think it's never happened before. So, I mean, there's
There was
probably is
one
precedent for
comparable,
it.
yeah, there was one comparable event, but it was before Texas was a big industrial,
Yeah.
heavily populated area. So there was a comparable event. This, by some measures, this one was worse. We don't know what happened in history. What the indigenous population went through hundreds of years ago. We don't have strong evidence about something like that. So it could have been, I mean, there's a question of which events could have happened in the undisturbed climate. So the undisturbed climate is basically what we had for about 10,000 years. It's not that long of a time geologically, but it was a period of unusual stability. Human civilization emerged in a period of unusual climate stability. And so what we think of as normal is actually unusually stable. And so we're taking this unusual stability for granted, and that's kind of not true. But in that context of that stability, you have sort of a what can happen.
Extinction.
Like, pardon?
Extinction.
Well, yes, I'm getting to that. But there's this concept of normalcy, which is built into civilization and which has some scientific merit. But there's also this normalcy is sort of an abnormal normalcy. That's kind of a weird thing. But within that normalcy, various weird events happen. Okay, now we're exiting that period of normalcy. We're entering a period of abnormalcy, and where it's even an abnormal abnormalcy, because normally what you would expect after a calm interglacial is for the Earth to get cold again instead of getting even warmer. So we have very little paleontological analogs. You have to go back really about 50 million years before anything similar happened. And we have very little evidence of how that all pans out. So something weird happens. Okay, it's 128 degrees in British Columbia. You look at everything that you know about this stable climate, and you basically say that's impossible. And say, well, that looks like it's going to get more likely, and it was pretty much impossible, and it happened. So that one you can say, okay, that really has the human fingerprint all over it. On the other hand, if a place gets colder than normal, you've got a much longer story to make, a much longer story to tell. And some people are saying, well, yes, the polar vortex, the jet stream, the this, the that. And you can make a case that that's going to happen, but the models don't do that. The people who are making that case haven't won over the scientific community, but they've gotten a lot of attention in the press. So the public sort of thinks, oh, this was another global warming event, and maybe it wasn't. maybe it just would have happened anyway, and it was just a weird outlier. So there was a hail event in San Antonio. There were a couple of really big hailstorms a few years ago, and I met a guy from San Antonio who said he now believes in climate change because he got hit by these two massive hailstorms. He'd never seen the likes of it. You look in the IPCC report, and on hail, it says, well, we don't know. We don't have any indication on which way hail is going to go. But this guy had these two weird events back to back. I think it was a few months apart. And that convinced him. But should it have convinced him? I don't know.
Well, I mean, weather and climate are different things, and you can't judge climate based on localized weather events.
Right. Except if it's 128 degrees in British Columbia, then you can kind of.
Well, I mean, if that happened once and it didn't happen again, it would still be more of a localized weather event, right? So what really tells you is that things like this keep happening.
Yeah. And that's how I look at it, is you want to look at the aggregate. And I always advocate for that. But people always want to determine for their particular disaster what it was all about. And so I don't know. Should I be didactic? Should I complain? Should I say, well, it's more complicated than that? Or should I just sit back and let people panic because some people think that letting people panic will motivate action?
Yeah, I don't know. Maybe the wrong people are panicking, though. I mean, who are the people who can actually do something about this?
Well, in a way, nobody can. That's the thing, is we have set up all these little ruts for ourselves. I'm sure living in Texas, even in these days where we interact with each other in person a lot less, I wouldn't be surprised if you got in your car once today. I got in mine. People have to live their lives, right?
Well, I mean, so the problem is, and this is a problem that politicians understand really well. If you take the actions that would actually completely mitigate climate change quickly, they would be very drastic actions that would completely subvert the economies that we have in place right now. Mm-hmm. So the smarter of those people have sort of maybe acknowledged that there's a climate problem, but they said we can't just jump right into it. So, maybe they produce something like the Paris Accords that says, well, gradually over time, we'll try to bring things down. We'll have goals. But others, who aren't as smart, just say, well, the economy is what I care about. I don't care about what's going to happen to the climate, 20 years out. And they just kind of let it go. And neither of those approaches is really going to work. I mean, the IPCC report says that by some time in the future, we have to reduce emissions by 100%. And
we do. 100% is the only number that works.
And when I first started doing this, when I first met Bill McKibben, he was saying, our goal is to bring the parts per million down to 350 parts per million. And in fact, today, as I sit here, we're at least 413 parts per million. So we're already past that goal. And I seem to recall James Hansen had said that with less than that, kind of like atmosphere, that we would be screwed. So maybe we're already screwed. Well, and I've actually been known to say that. I mean, I tell people, well, we're screwed. We're not going to be able to fix it. We're going to be extinct. What the hell?
I know it's hard to make humans extinct. We're a tenacious damn species. Some romantic,
like roaches.
Yeah, some romantics think, humans will go extinct and all the the squirrels and the bunnies will come back. And it's not like that. It will be the last mammal standing, I promise.
No, I agree. And we already see extinctions in other species every day,
So I certainly don't buy that. I think I have to line up with most of the leaders of the climate community on this. It's too late to avoid problems. We got problems coming down the pike.
Yeah, we're already having them.
Yeah, we see them. But 2 degrees C is better than 2.5 degrees C, and 2.5 is better than 3. And it's a long way between here and extinction. And we still have a beautiful world, and we still have a lot to lose. So there's one thing to say we're fucked, and it's another thing to say we give up. I mean, we are fucked.
Yeah, actually, I was in that conversation last night with a friend of mine where I was basically saying we're fucked, and he was saying, well, you can't say that you give up. And I wasn't really saying that I give up. I was just saying that, it looks really bad. I'm not going to stop doing what I can do, but I don't think that what I can realistically do is enough. And I don't know that there will be widespread adoption of climate mitigation measures.
Right. And this is where I came in. This is where I said, well, I want to talk about the future, not just about climate, but about civilization and the human mind, and how do we deal with all this stuff.
Because, and now we're down to our last 2 minutes, so you have to talk fast.
My concern is it's going the wrong way. And so my concern is that fighting on the grounds of climate may be, not just a losing battle, but not the important battle. The important battle, I think, is getting back to a place where democracy and expertise and just sense align with each other. And the answer to all of this is how we communicate with each other, and basically not letting Zuckerberg control that. Zuckerberg in particular, but the motives that he has are the motives that all his competitors have as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's not just Zuckerberg, and it's not just Facebook, and that stuff was happening before Facebook was there, So there's a lot to address for sure.
So that's kind of when I start thinking about what it's going to be like in 20 years. My question isn't climate change. I know where the climate's going to be in 20 years. It takes 20 years to even start to turn this ship. What I don't know is where human civilization is going to be. And I'm really concerned about the trends right now. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about. I mean, it's a good start.
It is a good start. I think that, we're out of time now, but I think that we should come back in a few weeks and talk about democracy, because I think democracy is, it's a word that different people define different ways or think about in different ways. And democracy is really hard, and it's worth talking about. But you know what Churchill said. It's the worst form of government except for all the others.
Well, yeah, but it needs to work if it's going to work.
Right on. Well, thanks so much for joining me today.
Oh, thank you. I've enjoyed this conversation.
You can follow the Plutopia News Network at plutopia.io. On Facebook, go to @Plutopia News. On Twitter, it's @Plutopia. This is the Plutopia News Network, 20 minutes into the future.